So I couldn't help but reach out. So Amy Lockner is our entomologist with the U.S. Forest Service, works for Region 2 Forest Health and Protection. I work for the State Forest Service. I actually work for Colorado State University as well. So we are two different entities. But Amy is kind of our local pro here, and she covers, most of Southwest Colorado for forest health issues?
Yeah, all of Southwest Colorado. So if you split the GMUG up, it's 7 forests.
Yeah. So anyways, I couldn't help but go straight to the experts. So we're going to kind of tag team this thing. And yeah, just want to say appreciate Extension reaching out to us and for you all you guys for being here. Great turnout. So I'll let Amy start ripping away.
Well, thanks, Sam. I'm sorry if this goes way too fast, but there's a lot of information here. So we're going to talk about bark beetles, and then we're also going to talk about the defoliator, western spruce budworm. But
can you all hear okay?
Yeah, sorry. Do you want? No. Okay. Thank you. How about now? Better? Okay, so we're going to talk about bark beetles and a defoliator, the western spruce budworm. We're only going to cover 3 bark beetles: mountain pine beetle, spruce beetle, Doug fir beetle. And then there's several others that are in Colorado, but just the main point to drive home is that these are all native. I know that they're acting out, they're being very destructive, but these beetles are native to our area, so they've been around for way longer than we have. Also, Dendroctonus is the genus, which actually is Latin for tree killer, so that's pretty cool, I think. So they're about the size of a grain of rice, they're really small. And most of them have a 1-year life cycle, and they kill the tree in 1 year. Spruce beetle is the exception. Spruce beetle takes 2 years to kill the tree and for them to complete their life cycle. Just very quickly, bark beetles live right there in the phloem where that green arrow is in the red. You know, we have other beetles. We've got wood borers that utilize the rest of the tree, but bark beetles are exactly that. They are right underneath of the bark, and they sit there in that cambium layer, which is responsible for, transporting food, nutrients, and then they end up girdling the larvae that are developing. So the adults go horizontal, and then the eggs and the larvae go around the tree. And so that cuts off that flow of nutrients. So here's a little quick on how the bark beetle works. So they find their host using their antenna. They can smell them out. They take a little taste. They decide this is the right host, so they bore in. And then the tree has these natural defenses. It's called pitching out. It's the resin that flows through. I'll just call it pitch for now. But yeah, the tree can actually defend itself. Usually that's during really wet years, or if it's just healthy and just doing great, or maybe genetics. But sometimes the tree does win. It can have a lot of pitch tubes on it, and the tree wins and goes on to live a happy life for another 100 years. And the beetles actually die in that sap, that resin, the pitch. Or the beetles get in. They say this is great, they start calling in a mate, then they start tunneling these galleries, and then they lay eggs in that gallery, and then that's where the girdling comes in, that's where the larvae start to develop, and they start moving around the tree. And then, so pretty much a year after they entered the tree, and all of this has happened, a year later, they become adults, and then they leave and they fly to usually the very next tree. They're not great flyers, and so usually they're just kind of bumbling around going right next door. So symptoms that you're looking for usually is pitch tubes over here on the right. We see that a lot, but during drought times like now, a lot of times we see frass. Frass is a funny, or I guess a technical term for beetle poop and it looks like sawdust, really. So those are really good things to look for if you suspect that your trees are looking a little sick. There's three components when it comes to having an outbreak or an epidemic. Those words are interchangeable. You have stand age, stand density, and stand composition. I'll let Sam here talk more about that here in a minute, but it really does matter to kind of try and break up your stand. You know, you don't want an even age. All of them are, 150 years old. They're all the same type, because then it's just a really easy buffet. Like I said, they don't fly very well, so if you don't have a mixed species forest stand, then it's really easy for them to just build up. So let's get into mountain pine beetle a little bit. Hosts are pretty much all of the pines that we have in Colorado, but lodgepole and ponderosa are the bigger ones. We do have an outbreak going on up Wilder in the Gunnison Highlands area. It's a pretty small outbreak. We've been working pretty successfully with Colorado State Forest Service and the National Forest Foundation. So that's been a great project. We're really happy. And but anyway, the mountain pine beetle, again, it's native. It just is getting the perfect conditions to be able to explode. And they like mature trees. I've seen them down into 5 inches in diameter, but that's only in outbreak mode. It's a 1-year life cycle, so it's usually July to July. So you see them typically flying around in July through August. And again, you'll see pitch tubes. So this was from the Gunnison Highlands outbreak. Found it in 2019. There's pitch tubes on that lodgepole pine. Peeled off the bark. We've got galleries and all kinds of pupal chambers and larvae, and then also adults, and they were very happy. Let's jump into spruce beetle. So their hosts are Engelmann spruce and blue spruce. They prefer larger diameter trees, so 16 inches typically, although in an outbreak, they go down to, they get disparate, 4 inches. That's pretty small. So they have a 2-year life cycle. It's pretty unique. That is only in, well, not only, but mostly in Colorado. In other places of the West, sometimes because it's a little bit warmer, they can have a 1-year life cycle. But in Colorado, they have a 2-year life cycle. If you have any spruce that fall down on your land, if you've got, blowdown, avalanche, especially if it's more than, maybe 3 trees, you should really consider what are your options. Can you remove them? Because spruce beetle can really utilize any down tree. The tree doesn't have to be standing and alive like a mountain pine beetle to like a ponderosa does. Trees that have fallen down, that they can totally inhabit that over several months of the tree falling. Just some signs. Typically you see some woodpecker work on the bole of the tree, some flaking. You've got frass. I've circled, there's a tiny little pitch tube. Those are really hard to find on spruce, so I wouldn't go by that. But then you have the parental galleries. Those are the ones that are going vertical, and that's what the horizontal galleries look like from the larvae. The larvae are up top, pretty much just look like maggots. And then you have an adult beetle there, and then her tiny little eggs right underneath of her.
Can I get the clicker? Can you hear me okay if I project like this? Okay. So real quick, I wanted to kind of show the magnitude of what spruce beetle has done really in the last 20 years. And I'm going to go through, kind of fire through these quickly, but this is just sort of a progression of spruce beetle in Colorado. So 2001, you barely see a couple of red dots up there in northern Colorado on the Wyoming border. 2002, we had, that population kind of exploded a little bit in the north. 2003. So you'll notice here in 2004, they're starting to map some down there in like southern Hinsdale County. We had a wind throw event down there, as Amy was talking about. These spruce beetle really take advantage of wind thrown trees. So you have a nice green tree with lots of resources for the beetles to feed on, but because the tree no longer has a root system because it's blown over, it creates the perfect conditions for really these spruce beetle to take hold. So keep an eye out. We're 2005, 2006, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. Now see how it's marching northeast. Here's 2013, and then finally this year they started actually mapping the intensity within those polygons as well. 2014, if you'll notice there, you can see Monarch Pass. So Amy could probably give more information about this, but we had some really interesting weather events that happened during the peak flight period that year. Actually, it would have been in 2013 that actually, you know, had some orographic lifting, picked up beetles and tossed them up onto Monarch Pass. And I'm sure if anybody who's driven over Monarch recently, you've seen some of the logging work that they've been doing there to try to mitigate all that mortality. Here we go into 15 and 16. And that's all I had for that progression slide, but this is 2018 here, and this is kind of a close-up of our basin here, but I'm sure a lot of folks have also been down on Slumgullion and Spring Creek Pass down south. Kind of where we're looking and where we're most concerned now with spruce beetle is you know, up above Pitkin and up in the higher elevations of Taylor Park, as well as in the West Elks, as we continue to see spruce beetle sort of progress along those high elevation spruce forests. Here's 18, 7, I guess we're back to 17. So we might have got our slides mixed up. That happens in collaboration here. And then Amy threw this one up for 2021. So this is data that was actually captured just this past summer from aerial survey detection flights. And so you'll see kind of some of those hot spots are, it's, you know, along the Continental Divide there, and then kind of in the Fossil Ridge area and upper Taylor Park. So I think I'll pass it back to you on that one, Amy. But just to show how quickly, you know, in an epidemic stage, these things can move across our landscape. It's quite impressive.
Thank you.
Is there an on button on that thing? Oh, there you go.
That might be the problem. I'm sure that you know.
There you go.
Sounds like it's working. Okay. So Doug fir beetle. This one's kind of nice because it only has one host, Douglas fir. They prefer, again, mature trees, but they will go for some younger ones during an outbreak. 1 year life cycle again, a little bit earlier in the season, kind of May to May, but they've been pretty chronic through Colorado for the last 20-ish years. You can't really drive through anywhere in Colorado without spotting a red Doug fir. The cool thing that we have, though, which we don't have for a lot of insects, especially our bark beetles, is we have MCH, which is a pheromone, and I know that Sam is going to get into that and some mitigation, but we actually have a tool in our toolbox that actually works really well. It's over 90% effective.
I'm good without the microphone. Okay, so that was a real quick and dirty on kind of the three main bark beetle issues that we've got going on. I did want to talk about some general concepts of how to manage this on your properties. Of course, the first thing is, you know, as State Forest Service and Amy's shop, we're always, as best as possible, open to come and do an individual site visits on the property. And so I'm going to go through some general themes, but there's a lot of caveats to a lot of this stuff. Our forests are extremely dynamic, and so we want to work with you as best as possible to come up with some of these management recommendations. But there's the old school tactic of direct suppression, that's identifying which trees are currently infested and removing those trees. We call that sanitation or direct suppression. And I'll talk a little bit about how we like to treat that wood to make sure we're being safe with what we're doing with that infested material. And then some of these concepts, when Amy was showing her triangle on why different stands of trees are susceptible to bark beetles, we're looking at some of these characteristics of these stands of trees. One of them is density, and so a very dense stand of trees that's growing up together, they're going to have potentially a reduced amount of resources and sort of an innate stress on those trees when you have kind of too many cooks in the kitchen, right? And so We can address stand density through practices like thinning, open those stands up so that the individual trees within that stand have more resources available and are basically more robust to fight off potential bark beetle impacts. As Amy alluded to, species diversity is a huge one that we're trying to continue to manage for on the landscape. As you've learned today, these bark beetles are specific to typically one genus of tree. And so if you've got all lodgepole pine or all spruce in that stand, by doing some things like forest management, you can create regeneration niches for other tree species out there so that when that Douglas fir beetle is looking to go to the next Douglas fir tree, but you've got a nice young cohort of aspen, it may not be successful in finding another host tree. And then, yeah, that stand age and tree diameter, typically the older the stand, the more mature it is, the bigger the trees are. Those trees often lack those defenses, and the same thing with tree diameter. The bigger diameter the tree is, the more room there is for those bark beetles to lay their brood and for their broods to be successful. And so as we look across the landscape, those are some kind of broad concepts, and we don't have enough time to go into. We could talk about our other really fun issue in the Gunnison Basin, which is our wildfire issue. The bark beetle issue is not, mutually exclusive with wildfire. They absolutely interact with each other, and a lot of our efforts on the ground for forest management are also considering those natural disturbances and fire regimes so that we're mimicking those on the landscape and try to, essentially we're looking at utilizing things like thinning and forest management and prescribed fire to mimic those disturbances that are going to create those younger cohorts of trees and diverse species on the landscape. That can be a heady topic that we could spend hours on, and I'll get you my number here. We can go have a beer sometime and talk about it if you want. And then these last two, disease and injury. So something to think about on your properties is, when you're removing trees, what time of the year, when you're pruning trees even. And so anytime you cut a tree down or you prune a limb, you're naturally releasing some of these terpenes and chemicals into the air that these bark beetles cue in on when they're looking for a new host. And so, as a general rule of thumb, kind of the heart of summer is that time when those bark beetles are out looking for new hosts. And so as much as possible, we try to recommend that if you're pruning trees or removing them on your property, you're doing that kind of on those shoulder seasons or in winter. I understand that's not always feasible, but as much as possible, we're trying to prevent that disease and injury from, and the disease part's a whole nother thing we could go into. And then as Amy mentioned, that prompt removal of wind throw and trap trees, and we'll talk about trap trees in a second, but yeah, that wind throw, like I talked about before, really is just, you got a nice, perfect green tree on the ground with really no defenses, and bark beetles really cue in on those wind-thrown trees. In terms of what to do with the material, if you have an infested tree, there's several different options for treating that wood. There's a reason why the U.S. Forest Service and the BLM, when you buy firewood permits, require that you only cut standing dead or down and dead material. Once the needles come off the tree and that tree is completely dead, those bark beetles are no longer in there. And so really, these trees that you'd be looking for on your property would otherwise appear healthy with green crowns, and they don't actually fade out until the following year. So just because a tree from a distance appears healthy and green doesn't mean it may have some bark beetle activity in it. So if you're removing these trees, it's important to try to cut those stumps as low as possible. We often find a lot of bark beetle brood habitat in that lower section of the tree, so trying to low stump those trees. And then we do have, they call it solar treatments, but basically using like 6 mil plastic to actually wrap up the boles of those trees. A lot of our literature talks about solar treatment, but in my experience in the Gunnison Basin, we don't get the temperatures that you would on the Front Range to actually like fry those bugs out of there. However, it does work really well at just a containment strategy. So wrapping those bowls in plastic good and tight. I've had 2 times now bears get into these plastic wraps of bowls too, so that's a watch out situation there. And then some of what we're doing, like with this Wilder Gunnison Highlands project, the Mountain Pine Beetle project, is literally just taking that material off-site at minimum a 3-mile distance from any available host trees. So if we're managing for pine, we want to make sure that wherever that wood ends up, we're at minimum 3 miles away. We've been very fortunate that a lot of the lodgepole pine from that project is literally going from the project site straight to the mill, and so we can kind of reduce the concerns there. You can debark if you want to get really strong and break your back. You can use a draw knife. They make attachments for chainsaws now that debark, and essentially that's opening up and exposing those bark beetles to the elements and drying that material out. And then, certainly burning is an option too, but we, use caution around that. Of course, you'd want to make sure you're burning at the right time of the year and things like that. So, and we have 2 minutes left or something like that?
Including questions.
Okay, including questions.
Including questions.
Okay, so I'm going to try to fly through this super quick. We do have some really interesting products out there. There are some snake oils on the market too, so feel free to give me a shout. But a lot of these chemicals, essentially when bark beetles attack a tree, they emit a pheromone that's an attractant, but at a higher part per million, that actually turns into a no vacancy sort of pheromone. And so they've synthesized that now, and we can put these bubble pouches out and actually make the stand seem like it's already completely infested with bugs and trick those beetles into moving elsewhere. Again, there are some caveats to that too. Real quick, chemical sprays. Most of our chemical sprays are non-target. We don't often recommend those. That's only something I would really engage a landowner on if it was a really high value individual tree, but that's not really something we're looking to do on a landscape scale, as they're going to impact all your beneficial insects as well. Just some quick, some photos of some thinning we've done in Douglas Fir. This is Double R Ranch, east of town. The point to show here is we've been trapping there, so we were trapping Douglas Fir beetle, and after we went in and we did both a thinning treatment and coupled with MCH pheromone, we got to that purple line down there with populations. So we do have some pretty good evidence of this stuff working. Amy, do we want to skip? I know Budworm was in the title. Do we want to skip over that in the interest of leaving some time for questions?
That's fine with me, and I can stick around through the 10 o'clock
Okay.
break if you guys have more questions.
Maybe we can, kind of bomb through some questions here. This is our most current map of the basin. This is the stuff that was mapped in that aerial survey in 2021, this year. So you can see we've got a lot of different things happening in the basin right now. And I think this is kind of our last slide. So should we see if do we have time for a question?
You bet.
Greg.
So a quick question, so if a beetle leaves its host tree and goes to the wrong species of tree its first time, does it just dive in, or does it try to find the right species of tree?
It usually tries to find the right species. We do have some evidence where Spruce Beetle will get into lodgepole and they keep going. They'll actually get in there, make a gallery that's maybe an inch long instead of maybe a foot long for successful brooding, but then they figure it out and they leave. And
We're
so-
hoping it stays that way. Otherwise, if we have some weird mutation, we'll have a super beetle on our hands. But that's so far they're species specific, yeah.
Two quick questions. The east side of Monarch, it looks like there's been some kind of a forest health management.
Yeah.
Millions of trees came out there and it was much needed, but the west side, it's like somebody went wild with a chainsaw, and now you've got all this beautiful beetle habitat laying on the ground. Are they gonna clean that up?
That is a U.S. Forest Service project. My understanding there, Walt, was that was primarily, so there is a lot more lodgepole on the west side of the pass than there is spruce, but the trees that they felled there were all dead trees, so they won't be a concern for beetle habitat per se. But I think that was largely to protect the road corridor from those standing dead trees falling on 50.
Okay.
So, yeah.
We got a fire hydrant, but not a beetle hazard, basically.
And I don't know what the long-term plan is, so I can't speak to that, Walt, but I've looked at that myself and wondered, is there another plan for that material? So, I just want to point out real quick over there by the Farm Bureau stuff, I did put a bunch of publications out, including our annual forest health report and some other publications to look at. And our website, Colorado, if you just Google Colorado State Forest Service, we have a bunch of cool publications on there. We've got a story map. Yeah, thank you. A story map that you can go on and actually go on and zoom around a map of Gunnison County and look at where all these insect and disease agents are currently at. So.
All right, thank you, Sam and Amy, very much.